Now you'll see, Emily whispered right against my ear, her voice threading through the funeral hymns and the suffocating scent of lilies. I turned to look at my daughter. Her eyes were red with grief, yet burning with anger. My chest tightened. Today was supposed to be nothing but tears and farewells, yet her words struck like a knife straight to my heart. Inside the pocket of my suit jacket, I felt the thick envelope Emily had slipped into my hand just moments before Margaret's casket. My wife, the woman I had once loved so deeply, was lowered into the ground. My fingers trembled as cold sweat ran down my spine. All my life, I believed I had chosen the right person to walk with until the very end. But maybe it had all been a lie. Behind me, the crowd was still sobbing, but all I could hear was Emily's words echoing in my head. Now you'll see. See what? I swallowed hard, my chest weighed down like stone. Could it be that the woman lying in that coffin had never truly belonged to this family at all? Don't look away, because what I'm about to tell you next will be even more shocking. My name is Thomas Miller. I'm 65 years old, a man who has spent nearly his entire life working hard with his own two hands. Born in a poor suburb of Chicago, I learned early on what hardship really meant. My father died when I was just 14. My mother worked two jobs to keep food on the table for her children. I dropped out of school and took a job at a machine shop to help support the family. From that day on, I carried a single belief on my shoulders. If I worked hard enough, one day my family would live in comfort and peace. I met Margaret when I was 25. She was one of the most beautiful women in our neighborhood. Long, dark hair, a smile both sharp and alluring. I'll never forget the first time I saw her at a friend's party. She walked right up to me, raised her glass of wine, and asked, "You seem like the kind of man who would never abandon his family, aren't you?" Without hesitation, I nodded. Looking back now, that question felt like a prophecy. From that moment on, my life became tied to hers. We married a year later, in a modest but warm ceremony. I swore before God to care for Margaret until the end of my days, and I kept that vow. I worked relentlessly, never letting her worry about money. By day, I labored in the machine shop. At night, I took on extra repair work. I used to think if Margaret could smile in contentment, then every drop of sweat was worth it. Then came Emily. I'll never forget the moment she was born, my tiny daughter cradled in my arms, wrinkled and red, but with eyes that shone bright and strange. I cried like a child myself. You will never know the poverty your father did, I swore silently. That vow became my greatest source of pride. In those early years, we were truly happy. In the evenings, Margaret cooked dinner while I held Emily on my lap. Sometimes we'd go on picnics by Lake Michigan, snapping photos that are faded now with time. I still remember when Emily was 5. She wrapped her little arms around my neck and whispered, "I want Mommy and Daddy to always be with me." I hugged her tight and promised, "I'll always be here." But then, like a cold draft creeping into a warm house, the change began, with Margaret. I was never a man of numbers. Every paycheck I earned, I handed straight to Margaret. I thought that was a wife's responsibility, and I trusted her completely. But then, a small incident planted the first seed of doubt. One day, while paying the electric bill, the clerk told me our last month's payment was still outstanding. I froze. I had given Margaret the money, as I always did. When I asked her about it later, she brushed it off with a thin smile. "Oh, they must have made a mistake. I'll call them back." But the way she quickly shoved the bill into a drawer, avoiding my eyes, gnawed at me. From then on, I began to notice more. Each night, after she thought I was asleep, Margaret would sit at the table, scribbling into a brown leather notebook before tucking it carefully away. More than once I wanted to open it, but the memory of her cold, piercing stare held me back. I told myself, maybe I'm just being paranoid. Maybe she's simply saving for Emily's future. But the truth revealed itself sooner than I expected. One afternoon, on my way to deposit my wages, I spotted Margaret's name on a list of priority clients at the bank. Curious, I asked a familiar clerk, "Why does Margaret Miller have an account here?" He replied, "She opened a personal savings account a few years ago. Quite a sizable amount, actually." I stood there stunned. Why would my wife keep something like this from me? That was when I began watching more closely. Through scraps of paper Emily accidentally picked up, we discovered Margaret had been transferring money into another account, one under a stranger's name. When I confronted her, she snapped, "Don't meddle in my business. I know exactly what I'm doing." The anger boiled inside me, but I swallowed it down. I was terrified of tearing the family apart. I was terrified Emily might lose her mother. But deep down, I knew. Margaret had already stepped beyond the line of trust, and this was only the beginning. If before Margaret merely controlled the money, now she had turned into a master of manipulation. I had become a joke inside my own home. At family gatherings or dinners with friends, Margaret always found ways to cut me down. Whenever I tried to share a memory or offer an opinion, she would interrupt. What do you know? You've only managed to take care of this family out of sheer luck. The table would erupt in laughter while my face burned. I'd take another gulp of wine to hide my humiliation, but nothing hurt more than Emily's eyes, sad mixed with pity, as she watched it happen. One night, I brought home a bouquet of red roses, the flowers Margaret used to love when we were young, to celebrate our anniversary. I held them out to her with all the sincerity I had left. She only curled her lip. Real men buy diamonds, and you think a few cheap flowers are enough? I went silent. I had never wanted anything for myself, just one warm moment in the middle of all this tension. But to her, everything I did was small, cheap, and beneath contempt. Worse still, Margaret's words became knives. One evening, after a long day at work, I walked through the door and she sneered. Do you even know that to everyone else you're nothing but useless? Without me, you'd be nobody. I stood there, speechless, her words echoing in my head, snuffing out the last flickers of my self-respect. Emily often tried to defend me. I still remember one time she held my hand and faced her mother. Mom, Dad has worked his whole life to take care of us. How can you say that? Margaret answered coldly, You're too young to understand. A man like your father will never amount to anything. That sentence shattered me. Emily fell silent. I felt crushed into dust. In that moment, I realized I was no longer the pillar of the house I had built with my own sweat and tears. Margaret's contempt even spilled out to the neighbors. Once, while I was crouched over the broken washing machine trying to fix it, she stood in the yard and raised her voice so the whole block could hear. You're always fiddling with junk. Real men do big business, and you're stuck with screws and scraps. I heard the neighbors' muffled laughter. Heat rose to my face, but I stayed quiet. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I couldn't bear to let Emily witness another ugly fight. At night, sitting alone in the dark living room, I felt invisible. Margaret would pass by me as if I didn't exist. Once I tried to reach out. Want to go for a walk? She didn't even answer. The sound of her footsteps leaving felt like cold water poured over my heart. Emily, my only daughter, had become my only refuge. Many nights she sat beside me, resting her hand on my shoulder, whispering, Dad, I know you're not useless. You're everything to me. I choked back tears, feeling both the ache and the faint reason to keep going. I thought my silence would keep the peace, but in truth it only fed Margaret's power. She grew more tyrannical, more cruel, more dismissive of us both. I knew then, if I kept enduring, it wouldn't just crush me, it would crush Emily too. The greatest shock came on an October afternoon, when a well-dressed man in a suit knocked on my door. He introduced himself as a representative from the bank, a thick folder in his hand. His voice was firm. This property has been mortgaged to secure a large loan. If the payments aren't made on time, we'll have no choice but to foreclose. I froze, cold sweat running down my back. There must be some mistake. I've never borrowed a dime. The man gave me a look of pity. The borrower's name is Mrs. Margaret Miller. The room spun. This was the house I had saved for over 30 years, a roof built with sweat and sacrifice for Emily, and with one signature, Margaret had gambled it away without a word to me. That night, I confronted her. She showed no remorse. Instead, she lifted her chin. Do you really think your measly paycheck is enough to send Emily to a prestigious university? I did this for our daughter's future. But as I flipped through the papers, the numbers didn't add up. The loan far exceeded any tuition costs. The rest of the money had vanished into a void. Where's the rest of it, Margaret? What did you do with it? Her eyes went cold. That's none of your business. You don't need to know. Emily heard the shouting and ran in, her eyes swollen with tears. Mom, how could you? This is my home too. Dad worked his whole life to keep it. Margaret snapped back. You're just a child. When you start earning money, then you can talk. I watched Emily crumble. She sobbed and clung to me. Rage and helplessness burned through me. I wanted to shout, to smash that arrogant mask off her face, but my throat locked. All I could do was hold my daughter tighter, as if she were the only thing keeping me upright. After that day, the house stopped feeling like a safe haven. Every knock at the door made my heart jump. Was it the bank coming to seize everything? Sleepless nights stretched on, staring at the ceiling, whispering to myself, how could Margaret be so ruthless? Does 30 years of devotion mean nothing to her? Emily changed too. She was no longer the gentle, innocent girl she had been. I would find her sitting for hours at her desk, papers full of figures and photocopies of contracts she had secretly taken. One night she turned to me, her voice steady, almost fierce. Dad, Mom doesn't deserve our trust anymore. If we don't act, she'll destroy everything. I stayed silent. Deep down, love for Margaret still lingered, but it had cracked beyond repair. I looked at my daughter, her eyes blazing with determination, and I understood. The time for submission had passed. That loan was only the tip of the iceberg. I could feel it. Behind it lay a darker secret, something Margaret was desperate to keep hidden. And if I didn't uncover it soon, this house, this life I had built, would collapse in her hands. Emily was growing up, and with that came a sharper clarity. She no longer bought into her mother's polished excuses. She had seen the shady bills, the blatant lies, and my own helpless silence. One night, as I was about to sleep, I heard muffled sobs from her room. I knocked, stepped inside, and found her on the floor with a stack of papers spread out before her. They were wire transfer receipts, all under Margaret's name, but the money had been sent to a stranger, Richard Coleman. Emily trembled, her voice breaking. Dad, Mom lied to us. She never used the loan for me, or for this family. She's been sending it all to him. I don't know who he is, but I know she's hiding something from you. I knelt beside her and held her close. My head swarmed with questions, none with an answer. I wanted to deny it, to shield Margaret's image in my daughter's eyes, but the evidence was undeniable. My silence was the only thing left, and that silence cut Emily deeper. From that night she changed. She didn't cry as much anymore. She hardened. She began shadowing her mother's every move, writing down phone calls, snapping photos of receipts, even asking a friend at the bank to check balances. In her eyes burned a fire. Anger, yes, but also a fierce determination to protect what little remained of our family. Once I came into the living room to find Emily standing toe-to-toe with Margaret, papers clutched in her fist. Mom, all these years Dad has given his life to this family. Why would you betray him? Who is this Richard? Where is the money going? Margaret paled, only for a second. Then she regained composure, slapped the papers onto the table, and snarled. You're just a child. Stay out of grown-up business. Everything I've done, I did for this family. Emily broke down, but this time she didn't run. She clenched her fists, tears streaming, and shouted, What family? This family has been dead for years, because all you ever cared about was yourself. I stood frozen, my heart torn apart. I wanted to stop them, to step in, but I knew Emily had the right to say those words. She had carried too much for too long. Later that night, Emily came to me in the darkened living room. Her voice was low, steady. Dad, I won't let Mom destroy your life any longer. If you can't speak up, then I will. I looked at her, my heart split between two loyalties. A wife of decades on one side, and my daughter, the last person still standing beside me, on the other. And in that moment I understood. My silence no longer protected anyone. It only fed Margaret's power. It was Emily who lit the spark of defiance in me. From that night forward, I knew open confrontation was inevitable. The truth would have to be dragged into the light, no matter the cost. That was the beginning of a new chapter for us, where every secret would be ripped bare in front of the world. The battles ahead would be brutal, but there was no turning back. The first public showdown came on a day no one could have predicted, at the baptism of a distant relative's child. What should have been sacred and solemn turned into a family spectacle that the entire clan would never forget. The church was packed that morning. I sat quietly in the back pew, Emily beside me, her face tight with resolve. Margaret, as always, arrived in an expensive dress, chin lifted high, basking in the admiration of cousins and aunts who still thought she was a woman to be revered. She laughed, she chatted, she performed her role to perfection. And I, as always, lowered my head, dodging the probing glances of relatives who must have sensed something was wrong. But Emily refused to stay silent. The moment the priest finished the ceremony, she shot to her feet. Her voice rang out, clear and defiant, echoing through the nave. Mother, you've been lying to Dad and to this entire family. All the money, all the property, you've been sending it to another man. Why don't you tell the truth here, in front of everyone? The church froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward us. Margaret went rigid, her face blanching before she forced a dismissive smile. With a scoff, she tried to brush it off. This girl is delusional. Thomas, look at her. Our daughter has worked herself into such an obsession she's inventing fantasies. I almost spoke up, desperate to calm the storm, but then I saw the fire in Emily's eyes. There was no going back for her now. She had chosen to rip the veil away in public, and nothing could stop her. Dad, you've been silent long enough, she pressed, her voice shaking the rafters. But I won't. I won't let her keep humiliating you, keep destroying our home. Here, this is the proof. From her bag, she pulled out copies of the documents, receipts, wire transfers, even a letter of confirmation from the bank. Papers fluttered into the air like shards of betrayal, raining down on the polished stone floor of the church. Gasps rippled through the congregation. An aunt cried out, "My God, Margaret, is this true?" A cousin muttered, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Margaret faltered, her mask cracking. She snapped, her voice unsteady. You don't know the first thing about money, girl. This is all a misunderstanding. But the tremor in her words betrayed her. For the first time, in front of a crowd, Margaret wasn't in control. I sat frozen, fists clenched in my lap. I had never seen Emily so fierce, so unyielding. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for both of us. And for the first time in decades, Margaret had been forced onto the defensive. The papers Emily had flung into the air hadn't even touched the floor before the church erupted into whispers, buzzing like a hive torn open. Faces I had known my whole life, uncles, aunts, cousins, now turned toward Margaret with suspicion. The laughter, the easy smiles that had greeted her moments earlier, were gone. Margaret tried to hold her mask. She bent down, scooped up a few scattered sheets, stuffed them into her purse, and faced the crowd with feigned calm. Please, don't listen to a child's nonsense. My own daughter invents lies to attack me after everything I've sacrificed for this family? But Emily didn't flinch. She took a step forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Lies. Then what about the mortgage contract on our house? Dad, remember? You were the one who received the notice from the bank. Why don't you tell everyone? The air seemed to collapse in on me. Dozens of eyes bore into my skin. My chest felt crushed. I had spent years perfecting silence, slipping away from conflict. But this time, Emily cornered me with nothing but the truth in her eyes. That look, a plea laced with anger, told me everything. If you stay silent now, you'll lose me forever. I drew a shaky breath and stood. My voice trembled, but my words came firm. It's true. The house was mortgaged without my knowledge. All the paperwork bears Margaret's name. I only learned of it when the bank came knocking on our door. The congregation broke into gasps. An aunt in the front row let out a weary sigh. Dear God, so it's true. A cousin muttered, shaking his head. All these years we thought Margaret was so capable. Margaret's composure cracked. She spun toward me, her voice sharp, laced with venom. You useless man. You'd side with her against me? Her words cut deep, but strangely, they also severed the last chain I had wrapped around myself. In that moment, I realized I was no longer her partner in life's battles. I was just an obstacle in her path. Emily seized the opening. She raised her voice so that every corner of the church could hear. Mother has humiliated Dad for years, and now, even when the truth is exposed, you try to deny it. But I won't let him live as a shadow anymore. I will protect him, even if it means standing against you. The murmurs swelled into a storm. Some relatives shook their heads in dismay. Others exchanged hushed, troubled glances. And for the first time, I saw sympathy, real sympathy, directed at me. Margaret no longer controlled the room. She was losing, not just to Emily, but to the weight of the truth itself. Margaret's jaw tightened. She tried one last time to salvage her image. Please, everyone, this is just a misunderstanding. I'll explain everything later. But her voice was drowned beneath the tide of doubt. The authority she had worn like armor was crumbling, piece by piece, in front of her entire family. I sank back into the pew, my heart pounding in my chest. Emily slid her hand into mine, squeezing it tight. And in that grip, I felt something I hadn't known in years. Strength. My daughter wasn't just my child anymore. She was a warrior. She had stepped into the fire I had always feared, and I knew this was only the opening battle. The war was just beginning. The air inside the church had grown thick, every breath heavy as stone. Margaret tried to compose herself, but I saw it, the faint tremor in her hands as she scooped up the scattered papers. She had always ruled with sharp words and an iron will, but today the gaze of our relatives no longer carried awe. What lingered there now was doubt and contempt. A cousin broke the silence, his voice cutting through like a blade. "Margaret, if this is truly a misunderstanding, why don't you show us proof? But if Emily speaks the truth, then you've betrayed not only Thomas, but this entire family." Margaret inhaled sharply, forcing her voice into its old, cutting edge. "I don't owe anyone an explanation. This is a private matter in my household." But Emily refused to let her slip away. She stepped forward, her words ringing clear. "No, Mother, this is no longer private. For years you've thrived on Father's silence. That ends here. Everyone deserves to know the truth, so Father will no longer be humiliated in the shadows." The murmurs swelled again, a tide of pressure crashing down on Margaret. Beads of sweat dotted her brow, her eyes darting desperately for an exit. Yet every glance was met with a stern, unyielding stare. Suddenly an aunt rose to her feet, voice trembling with fury. "We all know Thomas has given his life for this family, and you repaid him with lies and contempt. If you have nothing to hide, then speak the truth, Margaret." Margaret froze. She sputtered a few broken words, then fell silent. For the first time, she stood stripped of her command, her mask fractured before the entire clan. I squeezed Emily's hand, whispering, "You've surprised me, and made me proud." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "Father, this is only the beginning. I won't let her bury you any longer." At last, Margaret chose retreat. She cast a venomous glare at Emily before turning on her heel. Her heels struck the stone floor, sharp, hollow echoes like nails hammered into a coffin. No one followed. No one called her back. The room hung heavy, yet strangely lighter, too, as if a veil had been ripped away. The rest of the ceremony dissolved into whispers about Margaret. I sat silent, my hands still clasped in Emily's. For the first time in years, I felt less alone. My daughter had dared to do what I never could, tear down the facade in front of everyone. On the walk home, Emily murmured, "Father, Mother won't forget this. She'll come after us. But I'm not afraid. We must keep fighting, whatever the cost." I nodded, heart torn between dread and relief. Dread, because the true storm was still gathering. Relief, because at last I had an ally. The very child I had feared would be broken was now the one holding me upright. Thus ended the first public confrontation. Margaret had retreated, for now, but I knew her too well. She would never surrender so easily. What lay ahead would be fiercer still, not just battles of family, but wars of law, of money, of survival itself. After the church shock, I thought Margaret might back off. I was wrong. Just a week later, a plain white envelope arrived at our door. Inside was a court notice. Margaret had filed suit against me, asking the court to grant her sole control over the family's assets. I went numb. She wasn't just trying to mortgage the house. She wanted to strip away the little authority I still had. Emily read the papers aloud with shaking hands, eyes blazing with fury. "Dad, she's trying to make you penniless. This is a real war now." I sank into a chair, hands pressed to my head. The law was foreign to me. I didn't know what to do. But Emily was different. She set the document on the table and said with iron clarity, "If she wants to fight in court, then we'll fight in court. Dad, I'll find a lawyer." A few days later, she took me to meet Jonathan Reed, a well-known mid-career attorney in Chicago, a contact through a friend. His office was bright but serious. Jonathan listened, his brow furrowing, then said, "Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Miller has made a very bold move. That boldness creates openings. If we can prove she mortgaged property without your knowledge and diverted funds to a third-party account, we can file a counterclaim." "A counterclaim?" I repeated, surprised. He nodded. "Yes. Instead of only defending, we go on offense. She's abused trust and caused financial harm. That's financial fraud." Hope lit Emily's face, but I still hesitated. A lifetime of endurance made the idea of putting my wife in court almost impossible. Jonathan seemed to read my thoughts and spoke softly. Mr. Thomas, sometimes silence is complicity. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for your daughter. Those words woke something in me. I looked at Emily, the same girl who had confronted her mother in church, and I knew I could no longer be weak. We started gathering evidence. Emily dug up the hidden papers, the mortgage agreement, bank statements, wire receipts. Jonathan meticulously organized each file, flagging irregularities and building a timeline. Outside, Margaret kept playing the part of the devoted wife to the relatives. She had no idea that behind the scenes, father and daughter were preparing for a legal battle she hadn't expected. Just a few weeks later, the legal battle truly began. Margaret swept into the courtroom in an expensive blue dress, her hair styled to perfection, walking tall as if victory were already hers. At her side was a young attorney, brimming with confidence, a smirk permanently fixed on his face. I was the opposite. My heart pounded as I sat down at the defendant's table. But Emily was right there beside me, gripping my hand. Jonathan leaned in and whispered, "Mr. Thomas, stay calm. Today is only a preliminary hearing. Remember, we have the strongest weapon of all, the truth." The judge opened the proceedings. Margaret's attorney rose first, his voice loud and commanding. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Margaret Miller, has for years been the primary manager of the household. Mr. Thomas, due to his lack of financial understanding and poor judgment, has repeatedly made harmful decisions. For the benefit of their daughter Emily and the stability of the family, Mrs. Miller requests full authority over all assets, so they will not be squandered." Every word was a dagger to my chest. My hands trembled as I bowed my head. But Emily didn't flinch, her eyes locked on her mother, blazing with anger. Then Jonathan stood. His voice cut through the courtroom, strong and deliberate. "Your Honor, what you just heard is only half the truth. In reality, Mrs. Miller secretly mortgaged the family home, joint property, without Mr. Thomas's knowledge or consent. Not only that, she repeatedly transferred large sums of money into a private account belonging to another man, with no connection to this family. This is deception, and it puts at risk everything Mr. Thomas worked his whole life to build." Gasps rippled across the room. Margaret's face drained of color, though she quickly crossed her arms and leaned back with a show of calm. Jonathan pressed on, holding up a thick binder. "Here we have copies of the mortgage agreement, wire receipts, and bank confirmations. All clear evidence that Mrs. Miller violated her husband's legal rights." The judge took the binder, flipping through the documents slowly, nodding with a grave expression. Margaret clenched her jaw, whispering urgently to her lawyer. He shot up to respond. "This is a misunderstanding. Mrs. Miller borrowed the funds to secure her daughter's future education. There was no personal motive." Emily shot to her feet, unable to contain herself. "That's a lie! I was the one who uncovered the records. The sums my mother borrowed go far beyond any education costs. I never saw a single cent of it. She's been deceiving my father for years." Her voice struck like a hammer blow. I saw Margaret's shoulders twitch. She hadn't expected her own daughter to take my side so openly in court. The judge rapped his gavel for order, then spoke firmly. "This court will thoroughly review all evidence. For now, Mrs. Miller's petition for sole control of the family's assets is suspended until the origin and purpose of these funds are clarified." Hope flickered in my chest. For the first time, Margaret was no longer in control, and I knew, thanks to Emily and Jonathan, we had just landed our first real counterattack in this war. In the days following the preliminary hearing, our house knew no peace. The phone rang endlessly, most calls from the bank pressing on the looming debt. I sat slumped in my old wooden chair, eyes hollow, until Emily laid out a stack of papers on the table. Her voice was steady, almost commanding. "Dad, we can't just sit and wait. This is the time to strike back." Jonathan and I found more evidence. Inside the file was the latest bank statement, showing Margaret had funneled more than $250,000 into the account of one Richard Coleman over the past 3 years. The number hit me like a punch to the chest. I had worked my entire life without ever seeing such money, yet Margaret had thrown it away without hesitation. Jonathan organized the papers into a counterclaim. He explained, "We'll file against her for financial fraud, breach of marital property rights, and abuse of trust. If we succeed, Mr. Thomas, you won't just protect the house. You may also claim damages." The word damages sent a chill down my spine. I had never imagined taking anything back from Margaret, the woman I had lived with for over 30 years. But Emily's unwavering gaze reminded me this was no longer about love or loyalty, it was about survival. On the day of the filing, I walked into court with heavy steps. Margaret was already there, waiting at the entrance, lips curled in a mocking smile. She leaned close and whispered, "You think you can beat me? You've always been weak." I clenched my fists, but drew in a long breath, remembering Jonathan's words. Truth is your strongest weapon. Raising my head, I answered firmly, "It's not me who will defeat you, it's Emily, and you won't be able to bury the truth." Inside the courtroom, Jonathan presented every document with crisp logic, each point striking like a hammer. He held up the bank statements, reading aloud the staggering transfers to Richard Coleman. The judge frowned and turned to Margaret's counsel. "How do you explain these transactions?" The young lawyer stammered, scrambling for words. "Perhaps personal investments, not yet reported." But the judge cut him off. "These are joint assets. They cannot be invested unilaterally without the husband's consent." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked. Her shoulders trembled, her eyes darkened with panic. By the close of the hearing, the judge announced, "This matter requires further investigation. Effective immediately, control of all marital assets is placed under joint ownership, supervised by the court. The family home may not be sold or mortgaged further." Emily let out a soft sigh of relief. I turned to see a faint smile on her lips. For the first time, we were no longer playing defense. On the way out, Emily murmured, "Dad, Mom won't give up, but neither will we." "This is just the beginning." I nodded, knowing the storm ahead would be fiercer. Margaret would not only fight us in court, she would wage war outside it, in the arena of reputation and public opinion, and we had to be ready. After the noisy days in court, we thought all we had to do was wait for the law to take its course. But Margaret didn't stop there. She turned to an arena she had always known how to manipulate: public opinion. Within just a few days, half-truths and twisted stories were flying around the neighborhood and spilling onto local social media. It all started with an anonymous email sent to a few relatives and a local blogger with a taste for scandal. The message was short but sharp. "Does anyone really know the Millers? Rumors of a secret loan and Mrs. Margaret's hidden affair are being covered up." Attached were a few blurry photos and some spliced-together chat messages. By the next day, the story had blown wide open. The first knock on our door came from Mrs. Linda, loud, nosy, and always convinced she knew everything about everyone on the block. She cornered us, her voice low but dripping with judgment. "I saw Margaret with that man the other night. Don't tell me she's really doing those things?" Emily's blood boiled. She stormed out to confront her. "Mother did things that were wrong, and we've got the proof in court. But rumors have a biology of their own. They grow faster than any defense." A local blog posted a headline screaming, "The Dark Secrets of the Miller Family," and it drew in hundreds of comments. Most were condemning, some were nosy, a few faintly sympathetic. Margaret's name was suddenly everywhere, but always under a cloud of suspicion. And it wasn't just words, it was images. A shaky phone clip surfaced, showing Margaret stepping out of an upscale restaurant with an unfamiliar man. The video spread like wildfire. People started speculating. Is she cheating? Where did the money go? How could Thomas let his wife fool him like that? Each comment felt like a needle piercing my skin, each line a fresh cut on my heart. Emily, though, was different. Instead of being cowed, she moved. She reached out to a journalist she knew through Jonathan, someone far more reputable than a scandal blogger. Emily handed over the court evidence, bank statements, and urged her to verify everything before publishing. The reporter agreed to dig into it, but she warned, "Clickbait spreads faster than the truth. You need to brace yourself for the echo when this goes public." And the echo came, but in an unexpected way. A well-researched article appeared on a respected news site, laying out the facts from the court record, citing Emily's evidence, and openly criticizing Margaret's concealment. Neutral readers began to ask harder questions. Why did Margaret hide the loan? Why lash out so fiercely when it was exposed? The community split in two. One side condemning Margaret as a betrayer who exploited her husband's trust, the other defending her as a familiar figure they couldn't bear to see fall. Both camps were loud, and both pressed down on us in different ways. At night, with the doors locked and the house wrapped in darkness, the phone never stopped ringing. Some calls spat threats, Others sent mocking emails, and a few rare ones carried comfort. I held Emily close, listening as she told me about the cruel comments and the strangers who came to our door to ask questions. That was when I knew our fight for vindication was far from over. We had just stepped into another battlefield, the court of public opinion, where truth must be built on courage, patience, and sometimes sacrifice. The rumors didn't just linger in the neighborhood, they spread like wildfire to my former workplace. Even though I was already retired, the reputation and credibility I had spent a lifetime building were suddenly dragged into question. An old colleague called me, his voice full of unease. Thomas, I don't believe what the tabloids are saying, but you should be careful. People are talking a lot. My chest tightened. I had lived my whole life trying to walk a straight path, and now, because of Margaret's actions, my honor was being stained. Margaret, on the other hand, chose to confront the storm head on. She hired a so-called personal media manager to spin a new narrative, that of a wife falsely accused, betrayed by her own husband and daughter. On social media, supportive posts began to appear featuring radiant photos of her alongside captions like, "A woman who sacrificed her whole life, now being trampled on by those closest to her." But Emily refused to stay quiet. With patience and fire, she replied to comments one by one, sharing links to the investigative article, and even created a dedicated page to publish every single piece of legal evidence. She wrote, "This isn't just a family quarrel. This is a matter of truth and justice. Don't let lies cloud your vision." That page quickly drew attention. People started resharing it with notes like, "Let's hear both sides," or "Poor Thomas, working his whole life only to be betrayed." I read each line with a mix of pain and consolation. One afternoon, while I was sweeping leaves in the yard, a neighbor walked up quietly. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "I believe you, Thomas. Don't give up. The truth will come out." That simple sentence made tears well up in my eyes under the fading light of dusk. But public opinion is a double-edged sword. A group of gawkers gathered outside our gate, holding up their phones to film, shouting crude remarks. "Hey, Thomas, how does it feel to be fooled by your wife?" Emily stood in front of me, her voice fierce. "Leave my father alone." We had no choice but to call the local police to disperse the crowd. Yet I knew the storm wasn't over. Margaret had lit the fuse of this public battle. And if we wanted to survive it, Emily and I had to go further. We had to turn whispers into undeniable proof before the eyes of society. One night, Emily spread every document across the table, her eyes blazing under the yellow lamp. "Dad, we're going to hold a press conference. Not just one reporter, but many. We'll tell the whole story, lay out every piece of evidence. Once we do, Mom won't have anywhere left to hide." I looked at my daughter, torn between worry and pride. I feared she was being reckless, but I also knew that if we did nothing, the tide of rumor would crush us. So I nodded. That press conference would be the big gamble, a move Margaret would never see coming, and it would open a new front in the war, fiercer, harsher, where transparency itself would become our sharpest weapon. The day of the press conference, the small auditorium was packed with reporters. Cameras flashed nonstop, microphones pointed forward. I sat in the front row, my heart pounding, while Emily stood at the podium. She wore a simple white blouse, her face resolute, her eyes burning as if they could pierce through the crowd. Emily began with a line that silenced the entire room. "I'm not here to slander my mother. I'm here to stand for the truth and to protect my father, the man who has spent his life keeping this family together." Then one by one she laid out the evidence. The mortgage contract, the bank statements, the transfer receipts to Richard Coleman. On the big screen behind her, each document appeared clearly. It was no longer rumor, it was fact, stamped with signatures, seals, and undeniable numbers. Reporters scribbled furiously, firing questions. One asked, "Emily, do you have proof that this money wasn't used for family purposes?" Emily answered firmly, "Yes. I never received a single cent from it. I confirmed with my university that all my tuition was paid from my father's account. The $250,000 loan vanished entirely into my mother's and that man's pockets." A wave of murmurs filled the room. I caught a few reporters exchanging looks, nodding. The truth had never been clearer. Soon after the press conference, articles flooded in. But this time, the headlines weren't baseless or sensational. They read, "Financial evidence exposes Margaret Miller's secrets. Daughter bravely reveals the truth to defend her father." Public opinion shifted swiftly. Many who had mocked me now left comments like, "Sorry, Mr." Thomas, we misunderstood. Others sent messages of support. You're not alone. The community stands with you. Meanwhile, Margaret all but vanished from the public eye. Her media handler no longer dared to post anything. The image of the devoted wife she had spent years crafting collapsed in just a few days. I heard that even some of her closest friends quietly cut ties, afraid of being dragged into the scandal. One evening, Emily opened her laptop to show me hundreds of supportive comments. She smiled through misty eyes. See, Dad? Now people understand. We're not the weak ones anymore. I pulled her into my arms, feeling as though a massive weight had finally been lifted off my chest. After years of silent endurance, I was now tasting the true strength of truth and of a father and daughter standing together, but I also knew the fight wasn't over. Public opinion might have turned against Margaret, but the final battle still awaited us. The decisive trial where every piece of evidence would be laid bare, and justice itself would determine our fate. The day of the official trial, it felt as if the entire city had its eyes on my family. The courthouse gates were swarmed with reporters, cameras flashing nonstop. Dressed in an old but neatly pressed suit, I stepped out of the car with Emily by my side. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Dad, today we'll say it all. There's nothing left to fear." Inside the courtroom, Margaret appeared defiant. She wore a sleek black dress, her hair carefully styled, but her face betrayed the strain. Her young attorney shuffled papers beside her, whispering instructions. In the front rows, I spotted relatives who had once distanced themselves, now present with eyes full of curiosity and judgment. The judge's gavel struck, and the trial began. Margaret's lawyer rose first, voice booming with confidence. "Your Honor, Mrs. Margaret Miller has only ever managed her family's finances. Every expense she made was for her daughter Emily's future. Her husband, Mr. Thomas, misunderstood due to his lack of financial expertise. There is no proof my client ever deceived her family or used funds for personal gain." I sat in silence, my heart pounding. Each word seemed crafted to paint me as incompetent, while Margaret was cast as a selfless wife. But when Jonathan stood, his eyes blazed with conviction. "Your Honor," he began, his tone steady and clear, "we are not here with speculation. We have concrete evidence that Mrs. Margaret Miller unilaterally mortgaged the family home, violating her husband's co-ownership rights. More than that, she funneled a total of $250,000 into the account of a man named Richard Coleman. These actions were not for the family. They were acts of betrayal." He held up a thick file, each page stamped with the bank's seal. The judge nodded, signaling the clerk to receive the documents. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and a few reporters leaned toward one another, whispering rapidly. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but her hands gripped the arms of her chair. Her attorney quickly objected. "These documents do not establish intent. Mrs. Miller could very well have been investing or issuing personal loans." That was when Emily shot to her feet, her voice cutting through the air. "No. I am their only daughter, and I never received a single cent from that money. My father didn't either. That $250,000 vanished entirely into my mother's hands, and that man's... This isn't an investment, it's betrayal." The judge struck the gavel for order, yet his gaze had sharpened. Emily's words had pierced more deeply than any legal argument. I looked at my daughter, overwhelmed with emotion. For years, I had endured in silence, holding the family together at my own expense, and now it was Emily, my own flesh and blood, who stood up and shouted the truth for us both. At that moment I knew. This battle had reached its decisive turning point. The tension inside the courtroom grew heavier with every passing second. After Emily finished speaking, a barrage of microphones turned toward her. Reporters scribbled furiously, and some even live-streamed the proceedings. I caught a glimpse of a phone screen behind me. The headline read, "The Miller Trial, Daughter Exposes Mother in Court." The judge struck his gavel, calling the court to order. Jonathan immediately summoned the first witness, the bank officer who had personally approved the transactions. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped up to the stand, his voice calm and steady. "Yes, I can confirm that Mrs. Margaret Miller came to the bank on multiple occasions. All loans and transfers were carried out under her name alone, without her husband's consent. The total amount transferred exceeded $250,000. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Margaret's attorney leapt to his feet, protesting, "Your Honor, this only verifies the transactions. It does not prove how the money was used." Jonathan smiled, clearly prepared. "Correct. which is why we'll hear from the next witness. The doors opened, and a woman walked in, the former secretary of Richard Coleman. Emily gripped my hand tightly, her eyes shining. The woman testified that she had worked for Richard and had personally witnessed Margaret visiting his office several times, carrying thick envelopes. I once asked my boss about the source of the money. He just laughed and said, "That woman owes me far too much to ever walk away." Her words hit like a hammer. Margaret's face went pale as she burst out, "Lies." "This is nothing but a plot against me," but the judge's stern voice cut through. "Mrs. Miller, maintain order. The witness's testimony will be recorded and weighed against the evidence." I could see the cracks forming in her composure. The proud facade Margaret had built for years was collapsing before everyone's eyes. Her lawyer, scrambling, turned his attack on me. "Mr. Thomas, do you have any concrete proof that Mrs. Miller used the funds for improper purposes, or are you relying solely on speculation and indirect testimony?" The question was meant to corner me. I stood, my heart pounding. My voice trembled, but my words were firm. My greatest proof is my life itself. I lived with her for over 30 years. I gave her every paycheck, every ounce of trust, only to be betrayed. If this were mere speculation, I would not have lost my home, my dignity, and my daughter would not be weeping over her mother's betrayal. Scattered applause broke out from the back of the room before being quickly silenced by court officers. Still, I knew the truth of my words had struck a chord with those present. The judge called for a 15-minute recess. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw Margaret standing alone, her eyes red and wet. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the woman I had once loved. But then she turned away, cold and distant, and I knew. Between us now, there was nothing left but this battle. Emily tugged at my hand. "Dad, don't soften. This is the moment we have to stand strong." I nodded. She was right. The truth had come too far to turn back. And the final blow would land here, in this courtroom, backed by evidence that could not be denied. After the recess, the courtroom filled once again. The air was taut as a wire. Everyone knew the next moments would decide everything. The judge struck his gavel. Jonathan rose, eyes gleaming as if he had been waiting for this very strike. "Your Honor," he began, "we present our final piece of evidence, a handwritten letter from Mrs. Margaret Miller discovered in an old financial file." He lifted a sealed envelope and carefully unfolded its contents. On the paper, Margaret's delicate handwriting revealed itself. "Richard, I can't let Thomas find out. If you keep this secret, I'll continue sending money. The house is all that's left, but I'll mortgage it. Trust that everything will belong to us in the end." The courtroom froze. I heard gasps ripple through the crowd, cameras clicking frantically. Emily clutched my hand, her eyes glistening with tears of vindication. Margaret shot to her feet, shouting, "That's a forgery! I never wrote that!" But Jonathan was ready. We submitted the letter for handwriting analysis. The results confirm it matches Mrs. Miller's writing exactly. This is not only financial fraud, but betrayal within the marriage itself. The judge requested the signed forensic report. After reviewing, his voice rang firm. "This evidence is admissible." The room erupted in whispers. Margaret collapsed back into her seat, pale, hollow-eyed. Every secret she had fought to bury now lay exposed before the law. The judge fixed his gaze on her and declared, "After reviewing all testimony and evidence, the court finds that Mrs. Margaret Miller violated joint property rights, abused financial trust, and caused severe damages to Mr. Thomas Miller. The court rejects her petition for sole financial control. Joint ownership shall remain with Mr. Thomas and his daughter, Emily Miller. Furthermore, Mrs. Miller is ordered to compensate for a portion of the lost assets." The gavel struck 3 times, echoing through the chamber. I sat motionless, tears welling in my eyes. Emily broke down, throwing her arms around me. "Dad, we won. Justice is on our side." I couldn't speak, only nodded as relief surged through me, relief I hadn't known in over 30 years. At last I was seen, protected, thanks to the courage of my daughter. Meanwhile, Margaret slipped silently out of the courtroom, her once proud face gaunt and defeated. Reporters swarmed her, but she offered no answers, only lowered her head and walked away. I watched her go, my heart aching but resolute. She had once been my whole world, but now she was nothing more than a shadow of betrayal and ruin. As we stepped outside, the late afternoon sun bathed us in warmth. Emily lifted her face to the light and gripped my hand tightly. "Dad, from now on, we'll start over. No more fear, no more shadows. For the first time in years, I smiled, truly smiled, feeling the weight lift from my chest. The battle was over, and this time justice had stood with us. The trial had ended, the verdict falling like a final blow to Margaret's pride, but for her, the nightmare was only just beginning. The very next day, headlines exploded across every outlet. Margaret Miller loses case, financial deceit exposed. The fall of a perfect wife, betrayal leaves her stripped of honor and assets. Her name became gossip fodder on every street corner. Online, those who once admired her now mocked and ridiculed her. Some old friends even reached out to me, their messages bittersweet. Thomas, now we understand. You were never weak, you were simply too forgiving. I read those words with a strange mix of pain and relief. Margaret's reality was far darker. I heard she returned to a small rented apartment, keeping to herself, avoiding neighbors' eyes. The public relations handler, who once promised to restore her image, vanished, cutting ties and leaving her stranded in the storm of public scorn. Friends she'd trusted peeled away one by one. No one wanted their name tied to a financial scandal so notorious. Emily told me she bumped into a former classmate, someone Margaret had once supported. The girl only sighed. Your mother traded too much and ended up with nothing. People call her a traitor now. No one dares work with her. I could picture Margaret alone in that bare apartment, her phone buzzing, not with comfort, but with waves of vicious messages. People she had once looked down on now returned with cutting jeers. This is what you get for living on lies. I felt no triumph in it, but no pity either. Deep down, I knew this was the price she had set for herself. Years of belittling others, dismissing her own family, had finally come due. What cut deepest for her, I suspected, wasn't the loss of money, but the loss of the one thing she had always craved to protect, her reputation. In a community where pride and honor meant everything, she was branded a deceiver, the woman who lost it all. When Emily and I passed through our old neighborhood, I could hear the whispers, "That's Thomas, the father who won the case." But always Margaret's name followed, spoken with disdain. From a woman once respected, she had become the cautionary tale parents used to warn their children. Inside me, there was a faint ache. Margaret had been my wife, the mother of my daughter. Yet every time I remembered the venom in her words, the way she cut me down, or the nights Emily cried after her mother's cold rejection, I knew her downfall was inevitable. And even so, this was only the surface. The true weight of her choices still loomed ahead. Mounting debts, unstable work, and a loneliness that was closing in on her from all sides. Margaret's downfall did not end at the courthouse. It only deepened with every passing day. The debts remained, stubborn and immovable. The judgment in my favor only added to her burden, restitution payments, compounded by the staggering interest of the loans she had once recklessly taken in secret. Bank notices arrived one after another. I heard she pleaded for extensions, but her record was already blacklisted as high risk. Clerks who once bent over backward to please her now spoke without sympathy. Payment must be made on time. Otherwise, we'll seize every asset under your name. Her career collapsed soon after. The firm where she had been a financial manager terminated her contract with a curt statement, "We cannot retain staff whose reputation compromises our integrity." Once proud of her title, she used to walk with her head held high. Now every professional door was bolted shut. No company wanted to touch someone tainted with fraud, especially one whose scandal had made the papers. Emily stumbled upon a classified ad one day, Margaret advertising herself as a freelance accounting consultant. But there were no clients. On industry forums, her name carried a red warning label, untrustworthy. Isolation spread like a shadow. Friends stopped picking up when she called. Social circles, once eager for her presence, now erased her from their guest lists. Where she had once been celebrated, all that lingered were whispers. That's Margaret Miller, the woman who betrayed her own family for money. I heard she moved into a rundown apartment in the outskirts, cheap rent, a place where no one asked questions about the past. From a spacious, well-furnished home to 4 bare walls, it was a steep descent. The thought of it caught in my chest, yet I knew. This was the inevitable end of choices she had once defended with such pride. But the wound that cut deepest was not money, nor work. It was family. Emily refused every attempt at contact. When Margaret sent pleading messages, our daughter simply deleted them and said quietly to me, "I can't forgive her, Father." I've endured enough. I didn't argue. I knew Emily's scars ran deep. She had fought bravely to restore dignity for the both of us. Cutting Margaret out of her life was not cruelty, it was survival. As for me, some faint ember of pity flickered, but it was smothered quickly. I once believed decades of marriage could outweigh betrayal. But what Margaret had done was not a mere mistake. It was treachery, a destruction of trust that could never be rebuilt. One by one, she lost it all: her honor, her career, her wealth, her friends, and finally her family. The price was unbearably high, yet it was the consequence of her own choices, and now she bore it alone to the very end. In the final months after the trial, Margaret vanished completely from social life. The woman who once held her head high at lavish parties was now reduced to quietly shopping at a small market on the outskirts of town, avoiding the gaze of others. A few neighbors whispered, "She wears old clothes now, her face gaunt. She doesn't look anything like the Margaret we once knew." The weight of public judgment never let up. On social media, whenever a story about betrayal surfaced, Margaret's name was dragged out as an example. People called her a living lesson, the price of greed. Some cruel strangers even snapped photos of her in secret, posting them with captions like, "Here's the downfall of someone who thought she was smarter than everyone else." I knew that for Margaret's pride, those words cut deeper than the court's verdict. She once treated her honor as everything, trampling others just to protect her image as a successful woman. Now that image was shattered, with no pieces left to put back together. Meanwhile, her debts only grew heavier. Even the cheap apartment she rented was close to being taken away, because she couldn't keep up with rent. Rumors spread that she was selling off her old jewelry, once flaunted so proudly. Designer shoes she had boasted about were now listed online for next to nothing. Bit by bit, everything she had hoarded to display her luxury life vanished like foam on the sea. But the greatest blow was loneliness. Margaret had no friends left, no family. Emily refused all contact, and I kept my distance. Every now and then she sent me a message. "Thomas, can you forgive me? Just once." I read them, but never replied. I knew that if I softened, she'd only try to manipulate me again. I had lived my whole life under her scorn and control. I could never go back. Once, I saw Margaret standing at a distance, watching as Emily and I walked down the street together. She didn't come near. She just stood there, her eyes weary, before turning away in silence. In that moment, I realized she had lost the one thing most precious of all, her own daughter's love and respect. People say, when you lose money, you still have friends. When you lose friends, you still have family. But when you lose your family, you have nothing. And that was exactly Margaret's tragedy. From a woman of power, she became an outcast, living on scraps, surviving under the scorn of the public. No more spotlight, no more parties, no one left to hear her laugh. Only the darkness of loneliness remained, surrounding a soul rotted away by her own greed and deceit. I know this is a consequence she deserves. And it stands as a warning to anyone who believes they can build happiness on the pain and betrayal of others. When the public's interest finally faded, when people stopped talking about the trial and the debts, that was when Margaret truly faced the terrifying emptiness of her life. With no one left to cling to, no one left to manipulate, she fell into a spiral of sleepless nights. An old acquaintance, once our neighbor, told me that in her shabby apartment, Margaret often kept the lights burning all night. She would sit alone at the table, her hands trembling as she scribbled something down, only to crumple the page and throw it away. The room was always filled with discarded paper, like a graveyard of words that could never erase the past. Then the first letter arrived, sent through the post, the envelope wrinkled, the handwriting shaky. "Thomas, I was wrong. I thought I was strong, that I could control everything, but I destroyed my own family. I know you and Emily will never forgive me, but please read this. I can't bear the endless nights filled only with memories." My hands trembled as I read it. Part of me felt pity, but another part burned with anger. Regret. After all the years she humiliated me, after all the times she made Emily cry, only now she found the words, "I'm sorry"? I folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer, and didn't reply. But Margaret didn't stop. A week later, another letter arrived. Longer, more tortured. "I dreamed of Emily. She turned her back on me, wouldn't even look at me. I called out, but she kept walking farther away. I woke up with tears soaking my pillow. Thomas, I know I've lost everything, but please, just let me hear her voice once more." Emily glanced at that letter, then said firmly, "Dad, don't believe it. This isn't real remorse. She just wants to drag us back into the same old cycle." I didn't know how to answer. Deep down, I could see Margaret's loneliness was consuming her, But Emily was right. No matter how sincere the regret, the past couldn't be undone. The wounds she had left in my daughter were far too deep. No letter could ever erase them. At night I dreamed of Margaret, not the ambitious, cold woman she became, but the young girl she once was, in a simple white dress, smiling as she asked me, "Are you the man who will never abandon his family?" I woke drenched in sweat, my chest tight with grief, and I understood. Margaret's regret may have been real, but it had come far too late. Margaret's letters of torment kept coming, longer each time. They were no longer short notes, but pages upon pages, her handwriting crooked, with ink smudges in places as if blurred by tears. "Thomas, I hear knocking at the door every night. I think it's you. I think it's Emily. But when I open it, there's only the cold wind. I ask myself, why was I so greedy? Why didn't I have the courage to love instead of control? I miss those old dinners, when Emily was little, when we laughed so much, but I destroyed it all." My chest ached as I read. Yes, I too remembered those dinners, when the kitchen was still full of laughter. But she was the one who snuffed it out with her contempt and her obsession with meaningless numbers. Emily no longer had the patience. When she saw me holding the latest letter, she said flatly, "Dad, if you keep reading, she'll keep writing, and neither of us will ever be free." She tore the letter to shreds and threw it in the trash. I stayed silent, not protesting because I knew Emily needed to cut every tie in order to heal. I heard that Margaret had begun calling in the middle of the night. Her voice was hoarse, trembling. "Thomas, are you there? I just want to say I'm sorry. Emily, if you're there, please forgive me." But neither Emily nor I picked up. We let the phone ring until it stopped on its own. In the nights that followed, I knew she was plagued by nightmares. An acquaintance who happened to meet her said Margaret looked gaunt, often whispering to herself on the street, "Don't leave me. I regret it all." The image stunned me. She was no longer the proud woman she once was, but a lost soul, tormented by a past she could never undo. I won't deny that sometimes a flicker of pity rose in my heart. But then I remembered Emily, my daughter trembling in my arms, screaming in tears after her mother's cruelty. I remembered the house we almost lost, the endless nights of helplessness, and I understood. Margaret's regret was nothing more than a belated sentence, one she could never escape. Emily was right. There are mistakes that can't be erased with an apology. Sometimes regret isn't for forgiveness, it's for devouring yourself from the inside. Margaret had fallen into that spiral. Her final letters no longer begged for forgiveness, but read like desperate monologues. I hear footsteps in the empty room, but when I turn, there's only silence. I see Emily's face in dreams, but she turns away, disappears. I want to scream, but my throat locks shut. I wake up alone, in the dark. That was the cruelest punishment of all. Endless loneliness and endless remorse. I folded the last letter and placed it in a wooden box. I did not reply. I felt no hatred either. I simply left it there, a reminder that sometimes the true price of betrayal isn't a court sentence. It's the lifelong sentence handed down by one's own conscience. And Margaret would carry that sentence for the rest of her days. After all the storms, life for Emily and me slowly returned to something like normal. But this normal was not the same as before. It was calmer, lighter, like a massive weight had finally been lifted from my chest. We began spending more time together. Every morning, Emily brewed the coffee while I tended to the flower pots on the porch. One day she laughed and said, "Dad, I've never seen you smile this much before." I stayed quiet, just reached out to pat her head, my heart overflowing with gratitude. I also joined a local volunteer group helping to repair homes for struggling families. Each time I tightened a screw or fixed a light bulb, I felt myself come alive again, a man who could create value, not the useless figure Margaret once tried to convince me I was. Emily often came along, handing out food to the homeless. We didn't say it aloud, but we both knew. Helping others was also a way of healing ourselves. One afternoon, as we sat together by the lake, Emily held my hand. "Dad, I think we've really moved on. We lost so much, but we also found ourselves again. Maybe sometimes you have to walk through the darkness to understand how precious the light truly is." I nodded, my eyes blurred with tears. After so many years of silence, I had finally found my voice. The voice of a father, of a man worthy of respect. For me, happiness was no longer something distant or grand. It was simply the evenings when the two of us sat down to dinner together, free from scolding, free from contempt. Only laughter remained, and trust. And I realized something. A true family isn't defined by blood or by marriage papers. A family is where love, respect, and companionship exist. Without those, sooner or later, all that remains is an empty shell. As time passed, the wounds in our hearts slowly healed. Emily grew up faster than any girl her age. She was no longer just a daughter once scarred, but a strong young woman, someone who knew how to stand up for what was right and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Once, during a talk at her university, Emily stood before her classmates and professors and shared our family's story. She never mentioned Margaret's name, only said, "A person can lose everything when consumed by greed and disregard for family. But if we choose to rise again, we can reclaim both justice and dignity." The entire hall went silent, then erupted in thunderous applause. I sat in the back watching my daughter with a pride words could never capture. I also realized that the pain we endured had transformed into a kind of strength. I learned to treasure the simple things. A warm dinner, a kind word from a neighbor, a hot cup of tea on a cold afternoon. Once I thought of these as ordinary. Now I knew they were treasures. One day Emily asked me, "Dad, do you think you'll ever love again?" The question caught me off guard. My heart had been torn apart too many times. But then I smiled and said, "If someone comes along, not to control or judge, but to share and respect, then yes, I believe I could open my heart." Emily squeezed my hand and laughed. "You deserve to be happy, Dad." That night, lying on my back and staring at the ceiling, I realized I had finally escaped the shadows of the past. I was no longer the silent sufferer. I was Thomas, a father, a man who had stumbled but found the strength to rise again. Our story spread throughout the community. People came to me, sharing how they too had once been controlled by family, once paralyzed by judgment. I never preached to them. I only said, "I used to believe I could never break free, but if you dare to take that step, you will find the light." And I believe that is the greatest gift suffering ever gave me, turning my story into a beacon for those still lost in the dark. One crisp autumn morning, Emily and I walked down the little street that once overflowed with whispers and scornful stares. Now it was peaceful. Neighbors smiled and waved. One man even stopped to shake my hand and said, "Mr. Thomas, your story has taught us all so much. Thank you for your courage." I simply nodded, my heart light. I no longer felt shame or weakness. I had stepped out of the shadows, standing firm, held up by the love of my daughter. Emily, too, had changed. She had learned to live for herself, but also to open her heart to others. I watched her volunteer in community projects, sit with children who had no families, and give them hope by simply listening. Each time I saw her, I realized tragedy had forged a soul of remarkable strength and compassion. As for me, after everything, I finally understood the most important truth. Family isn't defined by blood or titles. It's built on respect and love. Someone may carry the name wife, husband, or even mother, but without sincerity, those titles are nothing more than an empty shell. On the other hand, a person who chooses to stand beside you, protect you, and sacrifice for you, regardless of labels, that is family. One day, standing before the grave of my ex-wife, a cold, forgotten place no one visited, I whispered, "Margaret, if only you had understood this sooner, maybe things could have been different." Then I turned away, holding Emily's hand tight. I refused to drown in the past any longer. Life was still waiting ahead of us, and I want to leave behind a message, not just for myself and my daughter, but for anyone lost in the weight of their own tragedy. Family isn't about blood, it's about respect and love. If you ever find yourself belittled, controlled, or diminished, remember this. You have the right to stand up. You have the right to live in a family that is real. Happiness doesn't come from titles or appearances. It comes from hearts that choose to love and honor one another. My story ends here, but if you recognize yourself in it, hold on to this truth. Love and honesty will always be the strongest weapons. And sometimes standing up for yourself is also the way to save the ones you love.